Thank you all for being here on day 2 of the C20 Technology and Security for One World Summit. Extremely happy that all of you are here for our main keynote of the summit. It is going to be delivered by Mr. Vilas Dhar, who is the president and trustee of the Patrick McGovern Foundation, a 21st century philanthropy advancing AI and data solutions to creating a thriving, equitable, and sustainable future for all. A leading voice on equity in a tech-enabled world, Vilas champions individuals and communities as architects, decision makers, and primary stakeholders in shaping our digital future. A trained computer scientist, lawyer, and philanthropist, he serves on the advisory council at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, the board of directors at AccessLex, an expert contributor to OECD AI, co-chair of the Global AI Action Alliance at the World Economic Forum, advisor to MIT Solve, director of the Network of Engaged International Donors, on the board of directors at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and as a trustee of the Christensen Fund. He's been named a young global leader and a global shaper by the World Economic Forum, and has previously served as a senior fellow at the Berggruen Institute, the Gleitzman Fellow on Social Change at Harvard University, practitioner resident on artificial intelligence at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, and the entrepreneur in residence at the University of Illinois. Vilas holds a JD from NYU School of Law, a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and dual bachelor's degrees in biomedical engineering and computer science from the University of Illinois. He's currently completing his doctoral dissertations, and his research really drives novel approaches to economic and policy infrastructure for a data-enabled society to support and empower vulnerable populations. Extremely glad to have him here with us. We already had a short glimpse of his innovation and innovative approach to dealing with the technology for social good yesterday, but we're extremely eager to hear from him a lot more today. Thank you, Vilas.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. What an introduction. A lot of words there, but I think what you need to know about me is yesterday for lunch I had some rotis and some kutu and some porial, and I was the happiest person in the world. That's really where we should start from. I want to share with you, and I want to start with just one simple idea. We are now faced with the idea that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In the unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy. This is a time for positive and vigorous action. These words are not mine, they're the words of Martin Luther King Jr. But Martin Luther King Jr., a hero of the civil rights movement in America, a bastion of freedom and liberty across the world, thought quite a bit about technology, and spoke often about the impacts of new tools, new products, and new platforms on fundamental questions of who we are as a species, as countries, as communities across the planet. And I think his words ring as true today as they did 50 years ago. The fierce urgency of now feels more urgent than ever. So we are in a time of deep change. We've spoken and we've heard from luminaries and dignitaries on this stage yesterday and today about the ways that new tools that we're developing, whether we call them generative AI or we look to the broad spread access to connectivity across the planet and the transformations in how people engage with their daily lives, we're in a time of accelerating change. There are those who would say that change is always good, that change brings us into new pathways, new opportunities, new moments to discover who we really are. There are those who would say that change is bad, that we lose sight of who we have been as we only look to the future. And yet there's a pathway to think about this that's less about change as an inherent value, and more about the decisions and choices that we hope to make as members of civil society, as creators of technology, as together those who envision our shared future. One of those choices is apparent, it's easy, and it's right in our reach. It's a decision we get to make about whether we value the inequality of the world that exists around us, and we're happy to be passive as the inequality continues and grows into the future. Or if we want to change course, if we want to step into the architecture of new tools, the choices we make around social institutions and the rules and policies that further their adoption, to create a world where human values are actually the driving force, not merely the opportunity of technology. Values that we'll talk about a lot today. Values that I hold dear, and I know all of you do as well. Values like compassion. Values like kindness. Values like joy. It's not often that we talk about these words when we talk about our digital future. And yet I wonder why not? Why is it that we feel that a quantitative, analytical worldview has to sit so far from what we know about ourselves that we are connected beings? That we find each other not merely in the ways that we interact, but in the ways that we think about common purpose, about shared values, about a spiritual identity that connects all of us, independent of what we do. So, while we're making these decisions, we also have to acknowledge that the we is quite a complicated term. I think every person in this room holds an incredible ability to join this conversation by virtue of your role, your capacity, your skills, your training, even your presence here on such a beautiful campus. And yet, let's acknowledge that the digital divide still exists. We won't belabor the point here today, but know that as we think about the opportunities of these new classical models of generative AI, 3 billion people across the planet still lack reliable direct connectivity. But if we were to acknowledge that we think there is hope, that there is a possibility that these technologies might help us do better, that the conversation shouldn't merely be about risks and harms, it shouldn't be about creating ethical technology, then we might start a new conversation. One about what it looks like to build not ethical AI, but rather an ethical society. One that's empowered by new opportunities and new efficiencies and new optimizations. What kind of tools would we create? What principles would we use to design them? How would we acknowledge and bring together communities to co-architect this digital future? Over the next few minutes, I'd love to share with you some of the principles of ethical design that we submit might be considered by coders and programmers, by businesses and communities of development, by civil society, by multilateral institutions, by those who seek to govern and support a future that works for all of us. And I'd suggest the first starting point might be a principle that I hold quite dear. To think about technology not as a matter of centering products, but of centering people. To start from questions of representation. And to think about deploying capital and resources where connectivity is still a major challenge, where digital literacy levels are low, but where the needs are great. I often think about this as the front lines of vulnerability. And I'll share with you a story that has really shaped the way I think about this. When I was a very young child, I've shared with you, I think when I spoke yesterday, my family is from Karnataka. And I would come to a small village called Agrahara. And around the time of Sankranti, Harvest Festival, I remember as a kid just finding such incredible joy to see these festivals as they happen, to be out on dirt roads surrounded by rice paddies, to see music and dancing, the triumph of a community that was finding a way to be sustainable for yet another season. I remember also the religious ceremonies that happened, the meaningful ways that people connected to the local pujas, the local temples, and the pleas that they gave for a good harvest, the reliance they had on a greater power to make sure that they would have the resources they needed to make it through another season. It was an incredible cultural experience. It was one that forced me to ask meaningful questions about spirituality and religion. And to tell you the truth, it was just a whole lot of fun. Many years later, I went back to the same village. This was just before the pandemic. And I went for the same festival. And all the good things I remembered were still there. The delicious snacks, the incredible energy, the frenetic pace, the shared joy. But one thing was missing, the uncertainty, the fear about what the next season would hold. It hadn't gone away, but it seemed less a core part of the celebration. And so I pulled aside a person I've thought of as an uncle for many years. I said, hey, tell me what's happened, what's changed? And he said, well, come and we'll go to the puja. And we went to the puja. And you could see a new relationship between the people in the room and the priests, between that moment in time where they sought some sort of solace, affirmation, because it was less a discussion about risk and fear and more about wanting to be there to connect spiritually. What had changed? Well, that conversation about ensuring a good harvest had moved from merely seeking blessings to a new tool that these farmers had in their pockets. And I wanted to know more, and so I asked to see it, and so he took out his phone and he began to show me. He said, you know, because of new changes in how we get information, I now get meteorological reports on my phone. It tells me how and when to plant for the best chance of success. I have a new tool that shows me when the best time to harvest is so that I can have the lowest risk of losing my rice paddy. There's a new tool that shows me when to go to market to make sure that I can get the best price. And there's a new tool that shows me when I get that cash in hand, how to put it on the India stack and be able to use it for electronic banking. These frictions, fears, and concerns that had driven that entire process, well, they hadn't gone away, but now there were new tools and interventions that help people take agency over their own decisions, to feel ownership, and to feel that they actually had a choice in the future that they had. For many in this room, this won't be an unfamiliar story. I've had a chance to learn so much about the incredible work that's being done here at Amrita University, through the live-in learning labs, to go out to communities and build tools with them. But I have to share with you, and as we speak to a broader global audience, these stories are still far too unique. They're still far too remote. We need to build a new mechanism by which we're able to do this at scale. To understand that the tools we build are not about maximizing economic production or increasing yield on large corporate farms, but rather to ensure that every person on the planet that chooses to be a farmer has access to the kinds of tools that remove fear, concern, and risk, and let them have a better point of access. To build technology that serves these people, there are a few principles that align with centering people. The first is making a public commitment to building open source tools, tools that are truly accessible to all, but also allow for an innovative engine that means that the work that's done in one place can be iterated on, developed, and grown. We think that this work is still happening, but happening in incredibly fragmented ways. To find those shining lights that happen in different countries and to build a common infrastructure which allows us to share data, to share models, to share interventions, and to share the stories of how communities use, deploy, and evaluate these tools. One call that we might make here at the C20 is to understand how civil society can play a role in doing this. That this is not a function merely for technologists to capture lines of code, but rather for us as civil society to step forward and capture the stories of communities. And I'll tell you one quick story of an amazing organization called Technovation. Technovation supports young women and girls across the world in all of their points of vulnerability. But in my discussions with their amazing founder and CEO, she shared with me something that I think is not told often enough, that women and girls are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of climate change because of their roles often as economic breadwinners for families, as those who manage domestic households, as limited access sometimes to education and economic opportunity. The massive disruptions on life and humanity that happen because of climate change are uniquely felt by women and girls. We know that we are working on digital tools to address climate change at every part of the human experience, but it's rare that I hear of tools that are being built that really understand the unique role that women and girls play, not merely in vulnerability, but also in adaptation and resilience. And groups like Technovation travel the world training women and girls on how to build digital tools that serve their communities. 3 young women in Delhi recently demonstrated a product that shows that the air pollution that's happening because of agricultural burning in Delhi has real impacts on people's lives and allows women to know what the projections are for air quality over the next day, the next week, the next month, and make better decisions about how they allocate their time. This model, again, should not be so unique. Why is it that we don't often think about how to take technology development outside of relatively sterile development rooms in Silicon Valley, in the kind of amazing technology centers that we have all around the world, and instead center, site, and ground them in communities of purpose, those who understand the problems they face daily and simply need access to the tools to build against them? From this point of centering people, not products, excuse me, I then think of an ethical principle around building tools that are just. Again, not a term you hear often. What does it mean to build a just tool? I'd submit that the general way in which tools often are built are a combination of innovation, something that I think of as a great virtue, that's then conditioned and bounded by profit-seeking behavior. Not all innovation leads to products. Often innovations are killed on the vine because those who are in business say, we can't find a market for this product. We don't think we'll be able to make a profit on it. So what if we instead were to redefine the problem? To say that rather than seeking profit, what we seek is increased agency in the sovereignty of communities. That we build products and evaluate their value based on their social impact, based on how we see communities rising to face challenges, based on how we see communities finding personal ownership and an identity bump that comes from being technologists. I'll give you an example. We work with a group called Digital Democracy, an incredible organization that supports indigenous earth defenders across the planet. Now, to tell you what this means, let's not code it in big words. Let me just tell you what these incredible people do. They live in their communities. They step forward. They identify where illegal loggers or poachers are coming into rainforests. And they step forward and stand in front of trucks and stand in front of electric saws. They sacrifice their own safety in order to ensure the dignity of the landscapes they're intended to steward. Groups like Digital Democracy work very closely with these communities to find ways to build just technology. Technology that leverages the very best of satellite imagery, of data science that integrates everything from forest cover information to new tracks around logging or poaching activity, to deploy down to the phones of individuals who are standing on the front lines information that lets them better find and better directly address illegal poaching and logging. Now, this doesn't mean that we are creating a new generation of earth defenders who are technically proficient and can build AI tools. The point's exactly the opposite. The technology serves to increase justice without creating a new obligation or burden for those who are acting at the front line of vulnerability. This sense of building just technology also requires a transformation in how we think about a technology workforce. It's easy to observe and easy to see that across the global north in particular, technology workforces are incredibly homogenous. There are often people who come from a particular set of privilege, a particular identity, who are accelerated through educational programs, are hired by massive tech companies, and then you can walk the campuses of some of these companies in Silicon Valley or across the global north and feel like you're in a different world. Not a world that represents the places where we work, not a place that represents the ways that we live. In order to build just technology, we need to share the economic opportunity of technology creation. And that means breaking the monopoly and the hold that large tech companies have over the development of these new tools. I'm speaking to you today from India, a place that for so long has built an incredible technology capacity. How do we make sure that representative workforces like the ones that we see here can exist across the planet? Here too, I think the role of civil society is particularly important in supporting educational pathways, recruiting, and mechanisms for building an entire pipeline of technology talent that starts as early as grade school, that makes sure that women feel engaged and empowered to take on careers in STEM, that makes sure that communities feel representation and know that they can find sustainable careers, that they can bring economic benefits back to their families, and to make sure that as tools are built, they know that they can be owned and supported by communities at large, to mean that we can break the stranglehold on profits that are held by a few tech companies. And finally, when we think of just technologies, I think of the idea of building tools that promote cultural values and cultural histories. In the early days of online translation, we found that many of the large companies that wanted to build commercial translation tools understood that they could very easily build for the 80 languages that were used by most of the world's population. And by doing so, they could cover their markets. They could be productive and profitable across the planet. But what about the thousands of other languages that are spoken by communities across the planet? By virtue of being left out of a global translation mechanism, they also were left out of participation in all kinds of benefits of the Web 1 and Web 2 world. We have the great pleasure of supporting an organization of indigenous AI scientists that have taken this problem and decided to address it head on. Instead of taking jobs at the large tech companies, they've instead come together to build a new center that tries to protect dead and dying indigenous languages, that works on capturing languages that often have less than 100 speakers, but bringing them not just as data records that allow you to train new models to protect translation for these languages, but by virtue of doing that, also to capture the stories, the beliefs, the principles, the cultural values that have been held for thousands of years of oral tradition. To make sure that even as we think about this modern technological marvel that allows young people to have access to these tools and these languages, they also have access to their own stories. And to take this one step further, this isn't merely about building new language models. We work with a young group of indigenous youth who have never coded before in their life and are brought for a 3-week program. And in that 3-week program, we couple an experience that lets them walk their traditional ancestral lands with an ethnobotanist, with a technology training program that asks them to create a new app. And I have to tell you, as I saw what these young people had created, I was just absolutely overwhelmed. Here's what they did. In 3 weeks, with almost no pre-existing technical training, they built an app that let them walk in their traditional and native canyons to find and identify a plant that only grows in that area. To take a picture, they built and trained a model very quickly that could identify what that plant was. And here's where things get really interesting. The model would return and the app would return back to the user the name of that plant in Latin and in English, right? I think something that many of the coders in this room would be happy to create as well. But then it would also tell the name of that plant in Lakota, in Crow, in another indigenous community's language. And all of a sudden, young people who had never had access to spoken words and now had a moment where they could actually begin to learn the language of their people. And then maybe in the next step, to connect that flower or that plant that they had looked at to a database of stories, of cultural mythologies that had that plant in an incredible kind of moment and connection, to actually let somebody who was walking through a canyon understand exactly why this plant might have had medicinal value or might have had spiritual value mattered. It changed the way that these young people intersected with their own cultural stories, where technology wasn't a solution. It was barely even a waypoint on the journey, but what it did was enable a curiosity. It enabled a set of people to ask questions about who they were, where they come from, and most importantly, where they could learn more. These aren't tools that are being built in the private sector because they solve a problem. They're being built within communities because they uphold a value, because they connect us back to our stories and our histories. And as we think about centering people, as we think about just technologies, I'll also ask us to think about what it means to bring compassion into technology. Now, when I talk about these topics in rooms across the world with CEOs and with government officials, this is where I get the most perplexed looks. How is it that compassion, a spiritual value, a value of humanity, a value of identity, a value of community, a value of who we are, might intersect at all with these machines that we build? And yet maybe that's the most important question of all. Why do we feel that it's okay to build technologies that propagate inequality? Why is it okay to deploy tools when we know and the creators have said they have inherent bias, that they are prejudiced on the basis of race, of socioeconomic identity, of where people come from and where they might go? Why is it that we're okay building tools that might displace many without creating any new forms of economic justice? For many years, we've been asking these questions, and I think it's worth it to identify the differentiator. When we were talking about building the next generation of email, or the next generation of a website, or a food delivery service, maybe it was okay to partition the question. To say, well, you know what, maybe some people will have some better access and maybe some people will be hurt, but overall, it'll be okay. I don't think that it's okay, but that's where the conversation started. But now we move into a different world. And here we begin to think about the incredible opportunities of AI, but the associated transformations that'll come with it. One of the things that we think about a lot is the fact that the displacement of labor isn't a 1-year story, a 2-year story, or a 5-year story. There will be massive displacement and reconstruction of economic opportunities and labor pathways. But let me ask a different question. Over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, when automation profoundly transforms what it means to use a unit of time to create a unit of labor. How do we think about allocating these new economic benefits that will be created? How do we think about the fact that those who hold capital or the means of production are going to be the ones who, at least in the first instance, will be able to own the machines that create new productivity? And often unvoiced and maybe less considered, how do we think about fairness and justice and compassion for the many, many millions who will be left out of that transformation? This isn't just about money. It's not just about a job. It's about the dignity that comes from knowing that you are a productive member of society and knowing that we are creating technologies that will fundamentally transform the calculus of how a community and an individual thinks about how they contribute to the world. So compassion isn't just about technology. Compassion is about the uses of these tools, about making sure that even as we create new tools that might change, for example, the way an author writes, that we're also thinking about the ways that it changes how an author is able to formulate ideas, to source from communities, to tell stories of meaning and purpose, to ensure that the tools we're building aren't merely connecting one word to the next, but rather are connecting words to stories, stories to justice, justice back to dignity. Compassion requires empathy. It requires a sense of shared identity. It requires us to acknowledge that the people that we are building for, with, are people just like us. It leads very quickly to the commitment to co-design, that this idea of building for has to be changed to the idea of building with. From our perspective, as we think again about civil society's perspective, this is a critical moment. Organizations that have, by their very existence, looked to serve humanity's interests, to support the most vulnerable, to provide services, to ensure that people have access to dignity and justice, have to be the ones who create the tools that we will use to work with these communities. We're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen when organizations commit to building data and AI-driven practices in-house, when large organizations and multilaterals and funders and foundations commit to the idea that building public infrastructure around data is just as critical as building products. We're seeing it as we begin to think about global data standards and data fiduciaries to make sure that the data that's being used to train these models isn't merely being used to, again, generate a profitable product, but is actually delivering a way for you and me and all of us who have contributed to those data sets to participate. And it requires new public funding and investment, something that we don't talk about often enough. That AI development and data as it happens today is happening in the private sector, it's happening with private capital, and yet governments must have a role in funding and developing tools that support public purpose, that integrate within them the social transformations that are necessary for us to look and care and say that we care deeply about these communities and even that we love them and each other. What kind of tools, and I pose this as a question to all of you, would you create today if I asked you to show your love through the tool that you develop? What would you do? I think many people would say, well, we'd like to find the problems that people face, to make their lives easier, to make sure that they could participate, to make sure that there'd be equity in the ways that they are a part of our society. Let's make sure that we try to build these principles into what we require, but also what we endorse and enthusiastically support as governments come to the technological revolution. I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk briefly about the need for multi-sectoral intervention on these topics. If we were to take these ethical values and rules that we've described and bring them forward, every institution of human presence has a role to play. We've spoken extensively about civil society, about the need for nonprofits to step forward to say, we know the problems that people face. We can build solutions with them. But what about governments? Much of the conversation that publicly happens today is about how we regulate the use of AI, how we make sure that we address the greatest risks, and how we prevent existential harms that an AI might take over. But I think my question's a little bit more fundamental. How do governments think about the transformation of the labor workforce, something we've already talked about? How do governments think about the delivery of basic services, particularly things like healthcare? How do governments ensure that benefits delivery is happening in ways that people have direct access? Now, these are questions that will be fundamental to the experience of citizens across the planet, and governments have to be across these topics Well, how do they do that? One is we call for a shared engagement with global learning. The governments need to develop internal capacity on data science, on AI, on tools that could totally transform the way they interact. In the United States, we've been really eager to see the development of something called the United States Digital Core, a program funded and supported by the US government with support directly from the White House that brings data scientists out of academia, out of college, and embeds them inside of government across the full scope of all that government does to begin to build new internal solutions. That intentionality by government to understand these tools and figure out how to deploy them starts from being curious, being open, and being willing to embed personnel in very traditional institutions to build. The next is regulation can't merely be a punitive activity. We've seen the development of new forms of legislation across the planet that are really focused on limiting, constraining, and bounding the use of these tools. And yet we ask, where's the opposite side of that coin? How are governments investing in developing use cases that support and transform fundamental access to things like education? I think many of you know, and I know there are many students in the room here, the delivery of ChatGPT sent transformative shockwaves through education across the planet. For many professors, for many academic institutions, the first response was an appropriate one, an understanding that this might change the way that students even begin to think, that they might cheat, they might use ChatGPT to provide, not their own work and commit plagiarism. Unfortunately, often the conversations stop there, and institutions often ban ChatGPT, and we saw an entire wave of these kinds of actions. But if we go back to designing for people and not products, one of the questions that we asked and that we've had incredible success with is, what if we change the way students use ChatGPT by changing the way professors think about pedagogical approaches? That if you are asking the kinds of questions that a student can use ChatGPT to cheat on, maybe it's time for the professor to change the way they teach. To go back to a world where they ask critical questions that require unique forms of thinking and problem solving. Experiential education that recenters the idea that becoming an engineer is more than just memorizing different approaches, but really is about problem solving. One of the uses of ChatGPT, something that I've seen that have been so incredible, is when you bring it a paper, and rather than asking it to write a report, you instead say, look at this paper and give me 5 review questions I should consider as I read this paper. And after reading it, to go to ChatGPT and say, write questions that quiz me on my understanding. And when I write responses, tell me what I missed, how I could do better. Think about what it looks like when ChatGPT actually becomes a possibility to support the Socratic method, to ask the 5 whys, to encourage us to think more critically even than summarizing what's been taught, but rather to think about how it aligns with what we know about the world, what we believe, what we value, and what we want the world to look like. For governments to engage in that conversation, it requires an openness to restructure some very basic and foundational views on education. And that doesn't mean that governments need to do that themselves. Instead, it means they need to listen to teachers. They need to listen to students. They need to listen to academic institutions. And build across each of these examples I'm giving you new avenues and approaches for public engagement, for civil society to be not merely a supporter of or an adversary to policy and regulation, but rather to be a co-creator of it. And then I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the role of technology companies. I'm a deep optimist. I've built many technology companies myself. I've invested in them across the world. I believe in human innovation. And so please don't take away from this talk the idea that I think they don't have a role to play. Instead, it's exactly the opposite. Organizations that sponsor human innovation are critical to the human transformation into a flourishing society. But many of these organizations still exist today to maximize on the things we've told them to do. To build profitable businesses, don't worry about what the effects are on the market. Let's not think of these institutions as separate from all of us. Instead, they're representations of what we've asked them to build. So what would it look like if we as consumers, if we as civil society participants, if we as stockholders, if we as public advisors could go to these institutions and say, we value your corporate responsibility as much as we value your profitability. If we could help institutions that have made public commitments to CSR say, these are not merely commitments we made because the stock price would have suffered, but because this is what we truly believe. It requires us to do one thing that's quite unique and quite important, to stop thinking of tech companies as homogenous institutions, and rather to think of them as a collection of individuals, each of whom brings a moral conscience, an interest in building technologies that make the world a better place, and a voice and a sense of dignity that affiliates with what they build. It requires us to re-engage with tech in a different way, to stop lionizing CEOs, and instead to understand that engineers, that software developers, that the people who make these companies run are humans just like all of us, and to create new modes of execution and engagement to allow these people to be a part of the civil society story. I told this vignette yesterday, and I think it's just so important to come back to. I've used the term human flourishing a few times here. I shared with you, and for those who are in the room, this moment in time where I would often engage with my grandfather, and my grandfather would ask me, "This technology you've shown me is quite exciting, but how does it help us be better?" And I'd like to spend a few minutes to just talk about the ways that technology might actually make us be better. These aren't stories about techno-optimism. They're not stories about the tools themselves. They're stories about what I see from communities across the planet. Communities where the songs they sing and the stories they tell are at risk of being lost, and technology helps them not just preserve it, but re-engage with them, to expand them, to build them, to tell new stories, to sing new songs, to tell new poetry. Artists across the world who are realizing that tools that generate art for them isn't art, but tools that generate art with them allows for them to express themselves in ways that just weren't even possible just a few years ago. I spoke recently with an artist who makes the most amazing 3D sculptures. And she shared with me that for much of her career, it would take her 6 months to conceptualize a piece, to begin putting it together. And often by month 2 or month 3, it might have taken a direction that she didn't feel embodied what she wanted to create, and she'd have to scrap it and start over. She knew what she wanted to create, but the process of creation took so much time and so many resources that she was constrained. She now uses a generative AI tool to rapidly prototype things that only she can see in her mind's eye, to come up with new schematics and new kind of descriptions and drawings, to move through those first 2 or 3 months so quickly that she can do it over and over and over again, that she can generate things she's always known in her heart she wanted to create, but just didn't have enough time. As an artist who's using a generative AI tool, she feels that she can be a better artist than she ever was. And in that moment of inspiration, efficiency and optimization becomes so much less important. It becomes about the language of the heart, the capacity to tell our stories, to build beautiful things, to build things that connect us with ideas, images, and views that maybe never could have existed without them. So let's talk a little bit about what we do with this. And I'm going to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I'll welcome questions from the audience and a conversation that we might have together. But we are here for the C20, a convening of institutions of civil society from across the globe under the great auspices of Amma and the incredible work that's being done here at this university. Convening is a uniquely human function. It's something that brings us together to discuss the very topics that we've struggled with today. What does it mean for one sector, one mandate, one set of organizations to hold this role as protectors of human dignity? How do we bring together government and the private sector? Institutions like hospitals and universities, institutions that touch every part of the human experience, and reimagine what they might need to look like in order to support us through a technological transformation that will change everything. The risk that we should be addressing is not that AI weapons will hurt us or that AI robots will kill us. The risk that we need to address that's more important than anything else is not a technological one at all. It's a human risk. It's the risk that when faced with this incredible transformation, we do nothing. If we are okay with the idea that tools will take care of themselves, that will address risks when they come up, that we don't need to participate because somebody else will figure it out for us, there we begin to miss the fundamental opportunity that sits in front of us today. To make tools accessible, to make literacy widespread, to build tools that actually foster and create human inspiration and creativity, to center equity, dignity, and human rights, to step into a public conversation not as experts in AI, but as experts in human aspiration, and say AI should be a part of a solution that we create together. It feels that we come soon to the idea of creating a new social compact, one where employers, manufacturers, the designers of technologies, the civil society organizations that work with communities across the planet, and governments need to come together to forge a new way of working, to define what we value, to name that kindness, joy, and compassion are things that we want to build going forward, to say that capital will follow our values, and that the products we create will follow where capital flows. The power of community isn't defined by past, or provenance. It's not defined by the interests that we bring. It's defined by a sense of shared purpose, of shared compassion, of shared values, of shared understanding of what technology creates as an opportunity. As we create a new digital future, building community will be the key. The fierce urgency of now compels us to figure out what that community should look like now. With that, I'm open to questions. I'd love to talk about any topics that the audience cares to, and I thank you so much for this invitation and for this chance to address you all. Thank you very much. Are there microphones? Oh, you're coming up? Great. I see there might be a question in the front. Please, please introduce yourself as well.
Okay. I'm Jay Misra. I spent a lot of time in the USA also and got educated in some of the places that I'm really happy that you've been trained at also. I just wanted to find out a little bit of a contrarian point of view.
Sure.
I really believe that what you're talking about and the mentality changes that it suggests for human beings to be the most important. But I see an essential problem that the mind that we have individually is the biggest enemy to all this. The collective happens after that. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a background on what the question actually is. Psychologically, we've known about climate change problems and other problems, and we consider it sometimes too big, and therefore we ignore it. We've been giving, as countries to each other, roughly 2.5% of our own incomes to international developing situations, and we do that mostly if there's a disaster. And that also is a level of compassion. And if I look at the wealth that's being concentrated, very little bit of it is going towards international agendas. It's mostly for the domestic ones, and more in fact, domestic and very, very small geographical areas. So with that, I also think about technologies that you're suggesting and saying the highest 5 technology companies, the highest companies benefit the most from using it their own way only. If I want Google search to succeed, I will take responsive AI and make it my own only, and I don't want other people to have it. So if I look at all this, I'm a bit worried. Can compassion be learned in this type of environment? Which is really what the answer we need for this that you talked about today.
It's an incredibly powerful question, and thank you for asking it. Let me say a few things. One is, I'm no naive, kind of doe-eyed techno-optimist, right? I don't think this happens by itself. And I don't believe in defaults. But what you spoke to, I think, is the fact that we live in a world where many of the ideas we've discussed at this conference aren't the dominant paradigm. You're absolutely right. The 5 largest tech companies that represent trillions of dollars in market capitalization will continue to do what they do by definition. And yet I think a lot about choices and opportunities. That, as you described around climate change, for 50 years we did almost nothing. And yet in the last 5, we've created more innovations around clean climate tech than we ever could have possibly imagined even 10 years ago. I do think there's something quite unique about the transformative moment we're in, where technology actually does allow us to critically examine the fundamental structure of systems of power. that even though it is the case that today there are 5 companies that hold this incredible might, how quickly could we generate and create an open source LLM that allows us to take the potential economic opportunities and move it out of that ecosystem? Well, that's a significant challenge, and yet one that's not inaddressable by philanthropy combined with academics, many of the people in this room that could actually build. What if we were to take that approach to solving every one of these significant social problems? To say, let's realign those sources of public capital that exist. Let's energize and motivate communities to take on what we held in our history of so many transformations as the core of kind of human movement building. The quest for justice that was never created by dominant systems of power, but rather by people who are trying to create an entirely new mechanism to build them. What I'm saying today isn't easy. But the fact that we're having a conversation about building compassionate and kind technologies is merely a starting point, right? To be able to actually bring that into the public discourse, to put it on the stage of the C20, to understand that there are institutions like this one across the planet that are trying to build these at small scale, and to say, how do we find and build a movement that connects all of them together to reimagine a future? That's where our aspiration should be. Cool. Thank you very much for the question.
Good morning, everyone.
Yes.
I'm Sparshika. I'm from MTech Cybersecurity. So we are talking about AI, chatbot, and all. So recently, the ChatGPT came. The data available, which is with ChatGPT, is more than which is need to be available. Recently, we were doing some assignments, and we referred ChatGPT. So when we searched for a question like how to hack a Wi-Fi, it gave the whole steps. So will not that bring risk for cyber attacks? Like even normal people can do accessing those steps and all?
You know, it's a great question. I hear this often. I'll give you the more extreme example from the creator, and I'll not name him, but one of the very large language models. He told me that one of his deep concerns was that unbounded creation of one of these transformers might let somebody ask a question, not just like, how do I hack the Wi-Fi, but how do I build a nuclear bomb? How do I synthesize a chemical weapon? How do I do X, Y, or Z? Let's really critically examine the question we're asking. Do we think the challenge is that because of these tools, somebody will have access to and go build a nuclear bomb because they had an AI? Why aren't we asking the question, what kind of society are we building, where people think about this is the first thing they want to ask an AI? It's a human problem, not a technological one, right? What is it that's around the society we've created that cyber hackers and cyber crime become one of the dominant uses of one of the most potentially positive and beneficial technologies we've ever built? And why is it that when we think about cybercrime intervention, which I think is an incredibly important practice, right? Our focus is on limiting access to adversarial technologies instead of trying to transform the underlying social structure that says that this is a criminal activity that you should go and try to do. It's not a satisfying answer, right? So let me answer your question more directly. Yes, of course, we should be putting in place socially created boundary conditions around how these tools can be used. Now, my question to you is, how do we do that? Because the current model is we've asked technology companies to do it for themselves. And I think that intuitively for everybody in this room probably feels like an unsatisfying answer. The lack of engagement by civil society, I think, has been one of the causes of that, right? So one of the calls that we make on a continual basis is to say participation in things like the risks of AI shouldn't be held exclusively by those who are creating it, but rather by the social institutions that are seeing how it's being used to create vulnerability. We need new forms of convening. We need new forms of institutions that actually allow individuals to contribute to what these boundary conditions should look like. And I think we are at day 0 on this conversation. We have made so little progress, but we know that over the next 5 to 10 years, this will be one of the critical things we must address. Great question. I see a few hands up, but I think people have microphones. Please.
Hello, I am Arun here. Yeah. What I see is like each and every technology we introduce, it comes with the boundaries and a set of rules and regulations and protocols we design. But what we see also at the end of the tunnel, we see that it leaves a lot of strains and side effects. For example, if I see, I'm just like, if you see the, it may not be related to one particular technology. See, suppose if I say 3G or 4G or 5G telecom sectors, nowadays we don't see any sparrows around. I mean, if I see it, Some people say that it is an impact of these all waves that moves around and all those things. It's not that it is not governed or framed within some protocols. Still, I could see that the side effects have come out. So we don't know how do we handle it. Like, was it missed out, or like how do we still empower? Because it's not, the society is not only for the human beings. Every creature that lives in the earth has equal rights. So how do we address it? We speak of including some section of people, but it's only for the people who speak, or like human race. But what about others? My concern is more on a geography. I mean,
Yeah.
for ecosystem, entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
So
You raise
Thank
some amazing questions there, and I'll actually split it into a few. The first is around the application of these tools for conservation, for ecological protection, for the environment, which we know is a priority. And there are some amazing stories that you should be familiar with, from wildlife tracking that lets us actually identify individual animals now to make sure they're protected in their habitats, all the way through to things like ocean poaching and ocean bad use, right? But your question is actually, I think, a little different. It's about what are the unknown secondary effects of what our activities are on the planet. And I think what you're raising is a fact that we still lack an infrastructure to monitor and understand these threats. That even as legislation is passed that tries to address risk standards, right, or tries to quantify potential risks, we can't quantify the risk of something we don't understand. What it requires is vigilance. Again, something that civil society has often been tasked to do is to be the ones that hold the center as new transformations happen that create new vulnerabilities. So I think that's quite important. But I'll say two other things actually. The first is this. When we think about transformations in human history, and you go back to the early 19th century and the introduction of the cotton gin that created the textile industry, the start of the modern industrial revolution, it took 100 years for us to build the social responses to the ways it transformed society, to build institutions that thought about worker welfare and making sure that people weren't being asked to work 20-hour days, right? To make sure there were government institutions that protected what economic and social transformations were happening. It took 100 years. With AI, I don't think we have 100 years. We have 5 years or 10 years. And what it means is conversations like the ones we're having here have to move to practice very quickly, because we won't even have time to observe some of the risks to the planet before we have so embedded them in how we build a society that's irreversible. So these questions give rise to just one last point, which is, well, fine, if this is kind of what we're thinking about, if this is the pace we're operating at, we're never going to be able to start from scratch and create definitions and a sense of shared interest around what it means to build a dignified and just community. Luckily, we don't have to. We have thousands of years of combined human wisdom, of philosophers and spiritualists, of anthropologists and sociologists who have come together to define these topics for us. Those conversations happen often in a different place than the rooms where lines of code are written. But we know this resource exists, and one of the key challenges, and maybe where I'll close here because I think we're at time, is to really consider this question of how we bring that incredible trove of human wisdom, spirituality, and focus back to the world of technology we create, so that we create a digital future that actually is one that works for all of us, that inspires us and makes us optimistic about, inspired by, and inspires the technology we create. Thank you all so much. I'll be around. I'm happy to have this conversation, but I appreciate all this time that you've given me. Thank you.
Vilas, thank you so much for your participation in the Technology, Security, and One World Summit. And on behalf of the C20 Chair, Mata Amritanandamai, and our engagement group, we offer you a token of our appreciation and goodwill. I'd like to ask Dr. Shashangan Ramanathan, Dean of Engineering, to present you with this token of appreciation and goodwill.
Welcome you to this important discussion on the effect of technology on our values, behavior, and connection to others, going from virtual to virtuous. The panel is going to be moderated by Puja Swami Amrita Supananda Puri. He is the senior most disciple of Amma, the vice chair of the Mata Amritanandamayi Mat, president of the Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham, and member of the Trioka C20. Swami Mr. Punacha Machaya. He is a successful entrepreneur and business leader who is passionate about consciousness leadership and well-being. He works with leading companies and industry thought leaders as the co-founder of GEO, a well-being platform that he created alongside international renowned physician and author Deepak Chopra, MD. He is part of a team of global industry leaders who are continually exploring the boundaries of what is possible in sports performance. Deepak Chopra Inner Space is a revolutionary new technology startup that he has co-founded that leverages grounding to reduce inflammation in both body, mind, to restore whole health and well-being. We have with us also Ms. Arya Jha. She has a professional background in journalism, PR, and communications. She is also an alumni of the prestigious Indian Institute of Mass Communications. Currently, she is leading the communication strategy for Y20 India as their Secretary of Communications. She also serves as the International Secretary of WOSY org. Dr. Bhavani Rao is the director of Amaji Labs, Amritapuri, and the Center for Gender Equality and Women Empowerment. She is also India's only UNESCO chair in women's empowerment and gender equality for India. Dr. Rao has led many field and research projects funded by the eminent institutions including UNESCO, UNDEV, UNICEF, the Ministry of Skill and Development and Entrepreneurship, and many more. Her work focuses on technology-based training, including vocational and life skills for the purpose of solving social problems, leading to the inclusive development of underserved communities, and especially women in villages around India. Dr. Srinath Reddy is an honorary distinguished professor at the Public Health Foundation of India. He presently serves as the adjunct professor of epidemiology at Harvard. He is also an adjunct professor of the Rollins School of Public Health, Emory University. PHFI is engaged in capacity building in public health in India through education, training, research, policy development, health communications, and advocacy. He is widely regarded as a leader of preventative cardiology at a national and international levels. The prolific doctor has more than 570 scientific publications in international and Indian peer-reviewed journals, and published a book titled Make Health in India, Reaching $1 Billion+. Swamiji, over to you.
ध्यायामो धवलावगुण्ठनवतीं तेजोमयी